According to a 2024 survey conducted by the International Women's Media Foundation, more than 31% of journalists have experienced online violence. The American Press Institute found that these statistics illustrate a troubling trend that many journalists grapple with every day, disproportionately affecting women journalists of color and LGBTQ+ journalists. And today, this trend can be spotted in Taiwan as well. Journalists are often singled out for their reporting, and while many criticisms directed at the media are valid, such as failure to fact-check, displaying bias towards certain political parties, or violating the ethical codes of journalism. But beyond these valid criticisms, many journalists have become targets of spyware, hacking, doxing, and online harassment simply because they are pushing boundaries and exposing uncomfortable truth. My name is Iris Xu. You're listening to The Divide.
My name is Jonathan Rozen. I work with the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Jonathan is a senior Africa researcher who's been tracking cyber attacks on media sites, on journalists, and their sources. And here's Jonathan on what these attacks look like.
Technology obviously is critical for journalism. Phones and computers are, of course, some of journalists' most important tools. But unfortunately, they can also be leveraged to harm journalists or to target journalists. We see regularly journalists being surveilled in various ways, including with a highly invasive spyware, which, when deployed on a device, can give the attacker access to the device completely, including the ability to turn on and use the device's microphone and camera. And of course, this is distressing for the journalist to be under threat of this or to know that this is being used against them. But it's also incredibly damaging for their relationship with their sources and their ability to actually do their job. The trust with sources is incredibly delicate, and it's incredibly essential for particularly investigative reporting when journalists are covering sensitive topics. So when journalists are targeted with this, or they fear they may be targeted with this has a chilling effect on their ability to do the kind of reporting that the public needs. You know, spyware is a particularly aggressive form of surveillance, but we also see the use of the telecom infrastructure, telecom surveillance being deployed against journalists. In Nigeria, we've documented the use of, or the police accessing call data of journalists and using that access to track and arrest them in connection with their work. Oftentimes also when journalists are arrested, their phones are seized, and there's a sophisticated type of technology called digital forensics tools made by various companies. And these tools are designed and have the ability to access a locked phone in certain cases and extract all of the information from inside a device. And of course, this is incredibly damaging for the privacy that journalists need to work. So these are just a few of the really serious types of surveillance and intrusion attacks that we're seeing. We're also tracking online censorship. I mentioned internet shutdowns. Of course, when there's no internet, there's no ability to publish online. This also hinders journalists' ability to do research, to gather information. Of course, so much of our lives now are online, and so much of information is online. And so without that access, it's really difficult to do journalism in the modern age. But internet is also essential for encrypted messaging platforms to operate. And so without internet, journalists are in certain cases forced or compelled to turn to less secure communication platforms, which can leave them vulnerable to the types of surveillance that we're seeing. We also document targeted blocking of websites when authorities leverage internet or telecom infrastructure to block websites directly, as well as cyber attacks, which knock websites offline. The different types of tools that are used to launch these types of cyber attacks. We're documenting the anatomy of these abuses to be able to understand them, to help journalists defend against them.
What Jonathan has said is incredibly interesting. The use of telecom infrastructure, telecom surveillance being deployed against journalists, and invasive spywares that can track journalists' every move. But who are behind these spywares?
Well, in the case of spyware infections, we rely on evidence provided by partners who do technical investigations, and they are incredibly skilled and talented researchers, organizations or institutions, including Citizen Lab, which is based out of the University of Toronto, as well as Amnesty International, their technical team, and Access Now, their helpline. These are incredibly skilled researchers gathering very specific types of technical evidence to offer us insight into who is doing this, and where where these targets are, and it's with relative levels of confidence that we're able to say who these actors are. There's also contextual information that can give us an insight into who may want to surveil a journalist. For example, in Togo, journalists have been surveilled, and journalists really around the world have been surveilled. There was a set of revelations that came out in 2021 that found that hundreds of journalists were selected for targeting with spyware all over the world, and many of them working on very sensitive topics connected with government corruption or other issues that maybe powerful people would not want disclosed. And so we can gain insights about who may want to actually surveil these journalists or intimidate them. But the things that we're able to confirm with a really high degree of certainty is the companies that are selling these types of technologies, offering them to governments and law enforcement agencies around the world. Several of them are Israeli-based companies, and we're always in all of these cases we're advocating for tighter controls on the distribution of these tools, and to make sure that they're not put in the hands of governments or law enforcement agencies that have records of human rights abuses and may be likely to deploy them against civil society.
So are there any existing regulations that oversee the usage of these commercial spywares?
Right now, we're advocating with partners around the world for tighter controls on these tools. There have been an executive order from the United States placing certain companies under sanction in connection with human rights concerns. There are other governments that are looking at taking action, but we're not seeing the level of attention to this issue. We're not seeing the level of government action to actually constrain this industry practically.
The lack of protection and regulations of commercial spyware has become a tool for corrupt officials, powerful people, and criminal organizations to track and harass journalists all over the world. In India, for example, the Pegasus project found traces of the spyware on the phones of 2 founding editors of The Wire. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists research, The Wire has long been a thorn in the side of the leadership for connecting the ruling party with allegations of corruption, promotion of sectarian violence, and the use of technology to target government critics online. Similar examples can be found across the continents of Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and even Europe. While little has been reported about the use of targeted spyware in countries like China and Myanmar, journalists in these countries also face surveillance from authorities on a daily basis. In June 2022, a New York Times investigation found that Chinese authorities collected more personal data about its citizens than was previously known. And these data not only contain people's digital footprint, but also their DNA information, facial features, and voice prints. Now, with these terrifying technology being deployed against journalists doing their job, what is the best way for them to protect themselves?
So at the Committee to Protect Journalists, our emergency response team is constantly putting out resources for journalists to stay safe in various circumstances, and that includes guarding against digital threats, including spyware. So we have an advisory on our website, which is cpj.org, where journalists can go and look at the most updated information to protect themselves against these types of attacks. Spyware is very difficult to defend against. It leverages vulnerabilities in technology that are previously unknown, and so very difficult to predict and guard against. But there are tools that technology companies are offering to limit those types of abuses. Notably, Apple has lockdown mode which it has made available on iPhones, which takes action at the device level to guard against this type of digital intrusion. But by and large, this is a very sophisticated type of cyber attack, of surveillance. And in many ways, it's particularly dangerous because it's so difficult to guard against.
As Jonathan explains to me how difficult it is to protect ourselves from falling victim to these spywares, I asked Jonathan if I would have known if I'm being surveilled.
That's the thing, is this is a particular type of secret surveillance, and in many cases you wouldn't know. Many times the journalists are unaware that their device had been targeted or infected with this type of spyware until a revelation came out, until maybe the technology company, Apple or WhatsApp, notified them that they had gathered evidence to indicate that they'd been targeted with this type of attack. So that's what makes spyware so dangerous and actually so harmful to press freedom, is that it promotes paranoia within the media community. You don't know if you're being targeted with this type of technology, and so that sort of psychological harm lives in the back of your mind oftentimes, and can have a chilling effect. Just not knowing whether or not you've been targeted, and knowing that so many colleagues around the world are being targeted with this type of sophisticated surveillance has a chilling effect.
Simply not knowing if you're being surveilled, but knowing the fact that you are at risk of it, is enough to send a journalist into paranoia, or prevent them from going after the truth. I asked Jonathan which countries' journalists are more exposed to spyware attacks.
I don't have numbers by country, but what we can say is that this number is growing and growing steadily. The Committee to Protect Journalists published a list and a map, actually, of journalists that had been targeted with spyware, as well as those close to them that had been targeted with spyware around the world. That list was published in 2021, along with a broader set of reporting on the different types of companies, and all of that information is on our website. But just months later, the Pegasus Project, this mass revelation of thousands of numbers that had been selected for spyware targeting around the world, was published by Forbidden Stories and a consortium of media outlets around the world. And that list ballooned the number of journalists that we were aware of that had been targeted to over 100. And since then, the case numbers of journalists that have been targeted with various types of spyware has just steadily grown. It's a steady drumbeat of revelations of journalists being targeted, members of civil society broadly being targeted. And it's really put this issue in the forefront of press freedom. CPJ has articulated the concern around this for years, and we've actually, because of its harmful effects on journalists' psychology, on the safety of journalists, because we've seen the way that this type of surveillance comes hand in hand with different types of targeting, physical violence, and in certain cases the killings of journalists, the jailings of journalists, and we've seen the psychological harm. We've labeled spyware an existential threat to press freedom.
Has anyone ever been held accountable for using spyware against journalists?
Well, the sanctions that we saw being placed by the US government on certain companies, this entity list, is really one of the only really concrete actions that's been taken against these companies to curb the industry that is profiting from the use of this technology. But there just isn't the level of practical response from governments that we need to see in response to this really dangerous technology and its application against civil society and journalists.
As the senior Africa researcher for the Committee to Protect Journalists, Jonathan has spent years documenting attacks on journalists in Africa. I asked Jonathan if there's any cases that really stuck with him, that he really can't take his mind off.
In January 2019, Ghanaian journalist Ahmed Hussein Swale Devela was killed in Accra, in the capital. He was sitting in his car, and two men on a motorcycle drove up to him and shot him. And then he was so shocked by the bullets that he actually drove into a nearby building. But this assassination is really particularly chilling because Ghana is considered in the region and around the world to be a stable democracy. This killing came just months after Devela had been working on and published with Tiger Eye Investigations a set of really dramatic reporting that uncovered corruption, alleged corruption, not only in Ghana, but in football across the African continent. And it's been several years since 2019. There was a lot of outpouring of alarm and concern, not only from the Ghanaian public and the Ghanaian media community, but also from the highest levels of Ghana's government right after the killing. But we have not seen really any action to hold those responsible for this killing to account. And time and again, when I speak to Ghanaian journalists, they tell me that this case looms in the background when they think about press freedom and the safety that they want to be able to do their jobs. And a number of years ago, my colleague and I went to Ghana and met with the family of Ahmed Devela, and his brother, who now serves as the spokesperson for the family, said that they just have not received the support from the authorities. They've not seen the commitments that were made right after the killing come to fruition. The investigation seems to have stalled. This impunity not only has sent a chilling message to the Ghanaian media community, but it also continues to loom for the family, where they do not have closure. They do not have a sense that the government is supporting them and is committed to holding those responsible to account. And in fact, amid their calls for justice in this case, they themselves have received threats. They've been told by people who call them anonymously to stop talking about the case. They, of course, are refusing to do that. They are continuing to remain firm in their calls for justice. And we at the Committee to Protect Journalists are joining them in those calls. We actually were aware of threats against Ahmed Devela. He was concerned for his life. After that reporting, he had received threats, as did other members of the investigative team that published that set of reporting. And then, when he was killed, the media community, responded very vigorously, but the impunity remains. And CPJ has called constantly for there to be thorough and transparent investigation, and the authorities in Ghana don't seem to be committed to fulfilling those obligations to the family, to the media community, and to the public, who deserve to have press freedom in the country, and journalists who are going to be working without fear to be able to deliver them the news.
Do we know who killed journalist Ahmed Devela?
We don't know who the killer is. There are a number of suspects, but that's, a major concern, is that when we don't have conclusive information about who is responsible for this killing, that sits in the back of the mind of journalists, where they know that the state is not seemingly committed to finding and holding accountable those responsible for this killing.
Devela was killed in 2019. 6 years later today, has justice been served?
4 years after Devela's murder, CPJ conducted an investigation into numerous other cases where journalists had either been attacked or threatened or arrested, and we found at least 30 other Ghanaian journalists had faced these types of abuses in connection with their work. And aside from a few patchy attempts at accountability, there was a broad pattern of impunity that really flew in the face of Ghana's reputation as a stable democracy. So not only is there impunity for Ahmed Devela and his murder, but in many ways it's emblematic of a broader set of concerns that the media community has, where when a journalist is attacked, there just isn't accountability. There isn't the level of follow-up and attention from authorities. So that investigation was published in early 2023 to mark 4 years since Ahmed Devela's murder. But even in the 2 years since then, that pattern unfortunately has continued. We are not seeing the level of attention, the level of political will from Ghana's government, from law enforcement, from investigators, when journalists are attacked, when they're threatened, or when they're arrested.
You're listening to The Divide. This episode is produced by Radio Taiwan International.